Hey everybody, thanks again for joining us on another episode of Thriving with Rachael and Dr. Lou. I know last week we kind of left off on wanting to explore expectations. I know we talked a lot about unhelpful thinking as well, so I wasn't sure if you had anything in particular that you wanted to touch on with that. I know I want to go over a definition around it a little bit.
Well, I know you really spend a lot of times, particularly in your groups and with individuals, talking about the role of expectations, and so maybe it would be helpful to kind of define how do you see expectation as a definition, and how does that impact, how people kind of judge themselves, if you will?
Yeah, I mean, I think expectation plays a huge role in experience in general, and if you were to look up the definition in the dictionary, it's a preconceived notion or belief about how things should be. Like, it literally uses the word should, and we already know that word because we can't predict the future. It essentially sets you up to fail, because can you ever predict 100% of how things will be? No. So a lot of times when, that's the definition, how things should be, which I think is automatically how we think about it too, you're already kind of setting yourself up for that disappointment that I think we associate with expectations sometimes. So I know, you touched on last week, it's not about getting rid of an expectation necessarily, right, but I wonder if it's challenging or changing the definition of expectation, like how I hope things will be. It allows for less rigidity, I guess, more flexibility with how you get to what you want, and it broadens the picture, I think, as opposed to this is how it has to be for me to say, great, good job.
So if the definition of expectation includes that word should, and that's a setup, what do we have instead of expectations?
Well, do you have to, that's I guess my point though, do you have to not have expectations, or do you just change the definition? A lot of times...
What's an alternative definition? I mean, Webster's might have a problem with this.
Well, it's just not it might be the definition, but it's not a helpful way of thinking about things, or I guess planning our days, for how things should be. It doesn't allow for space. It doesn't allow for error. It doesn't allow for life to happen. And so I would challenge the definition to be more so around how I hope things would be,
So what if we changed expectation to preferences?
That I prefer, that's this, yeah, that'd be...
My preferences are this for today. Because that allows us the flexibility for life to happen. Our daughter to, not take a nap that day,
right.
and be able to adjust to it.
I mean, I guess it always goes back to semantics, right? Like, what does it mean to you?
Yeah.
I guess you have to look at, though, when you're in a state of disappointment, where are you putting your energy? Like, where's the judgment coming from? Because a lot, at least for me, when I am in a state of judgment as it relates to expectation, a lot of times I judge myself after the fact. So I know I talked last week about struggling to get into a workout routine, and after I didn't do it, or I didn't go outside, I'd be like, oh, see, you did it again. And so I set myself up I expected that this day would involve a lot of outdoors, it would involve exercise, it would be smooth, and then when it wasn't, you failed, is how my brain interpreted it. And so if I were to look at, well, what was the purpose behind that goal? Why did I expect that? What was my hope for that? Well, my hope was to get sunshine. My hope was to spend time with my family. My hope was not to be working, and is there a way that I can obtain that goal without having to be outside every second, or without having to go to the gym, or to, do a workout routine? Yeah. If I'm willing to adjust the expectation or the definition or, preference, I would prefer that I spend time with my family outside. Okay, can I do that? Yeah, we ate dinner on the deck. I didn't do all this movement around, the deck, right. but I ate outside, and that was because I allowed myself to be in that space. I was able to sit with that and be present with being outside, which the purpose was to be in the fresh air and the sun. But I think so often we set up this expectation, how things should be, and the moment we realize that they're not that way, we can't move from it. At least that's my experience. I harp on the fact that it wasn't the way I planned, that it's over, and I gotta, try again next week, or, tomorrow, or I say it's not possible for me. That's the rabbit hole I go down with that definition.
Well, how do you speak to those individuals who kind of thrive on having things exact, having things defined as a way of measuring. In other words, if I have a preference to do X, like if I'm at work,
Mm-hmm.
and the boss says, you know, you need to produce X amount of widgets. Well, is it a preference that, you know, I you know, make 100 boxes of something for somebody? Or is it an expectation? And is that tied to my pay? So, like,
I think that's where we get stuck, though. The world promotes expectations around the shoulds.
yeah.
But it also promotes around things that we don't always directly control, like sales, for instance. You know, sales.
Huge.
A salesperson's it's based on commission primarily. Yeah. Maybe you have a base, but commission is your main source of income. And if you don't hit certain numbers, certain sales, you don't get certain commissions, and that directly affects your lifestyle and your income. So again, I think it's promoted that way in society, that this is how it should be. This is what is expected of you. And that's just how it is. But the problem is we take that on, we own it. Mm-hmm. And we say, well, I'm not a good enough salesperson. When you could have the best pitch ever and they're just not in the market.
Well, this last year and a half, right?
Perfect
with
example.
With COVID, so many things, what we would have predicted back in 2019 never happened in 2020 because it rocked our world. Mm-hmm. And so, you know, expectations without taking into account context and the world and how it mm-hmm. operates, the unpredictability of so many things, it can't go one without the other.
Right, but if we don't go into it with that expectation, no pun intended, or a different definition of it, then there's no movement, right? Like the perfect example is like how many of us were so in denial that this was even a thing that was happening, that COVID was even a real thing, mm-hmm. until it actually hit your home, until mm-hmm. it was in your neighborhood, until it was something that affected your job or your family, you know, like I think it was something that was foreign for a long time, and we were a lot of times in denial. I mean, I remember back in, May, we were saying, oh, we're all coming back in June. We're all, you know, no more virtual, we're coming back in June because this is what they were predicting, right? And that was the game plan. And when staff was like, no, mm-hmm. it was like, it kind of, I didn't know what to do. Like, I wasn't, because that was how it was supposed to be. And I think that's
prediction.
But that's where we were, and that was the presentation. So had we not been flexible and recognized it can't be the way that you initially planned because that's the only way it works, we would be really stuck right now.
Yeah.
You know, we wouldn't be actually meeting the needs of a lot of people in the community. We wouldn't have been listening to staff, you know, like, and that's again why I think we need to reevaluate the expectation definition. Because what is the purpose of coming back in person? Our goal with that was because we wanted to meet the community needs, that people mm-hmm. want to be in person. We are social beings, right? Mm-hmm. But that won't meet the need of people in the community that can't come in person.
Right.
You know? And so not to, you know, go down that road, but that's a perfect example of needing to adjust the expectation and looking at what the function of what I wanted. Right. You know, what is the purpose, or what were you ultimately trying to get with this vision of going outside? Fresh air. Guess what? You can actually open your window at night
and get fresh air.
You don't, if that's the function of it, right?
Well, it's something that we often talk about is be rigid on the goal, but flexible in how you get there, right?
Right.
So knowing that this is what I want, but there are many ways to get there, mm-hmm. is really kind of the trick, if you will, mm-hmm. to being flexible and adjusting to life's problems or life curveballs. And so being clear that this is where we want to end up, we may need to have supports to kind of bounce ideas off of and brainstorm ideas of how we might be able to get somewhere, mm-hmm. given the various roadblocks mm-hmm. or detours that we might have to take. And we still want to go there. It's just a matter of how we're going to get there.
I think the problem is, though, is we lose sight of that question, though.
How?
You know, yeah, like
how we're going to get there,
or even that where we wanted to go in the first place, because often we're stuck on the visual surrounding what we thought was the goal.
Right.
That we kind of, at least for me, I kind of cut off. Well, I can't have it. Mm-hmm. It's like
because it didn't happen this way, I'm not going to be able to do it.
Non-existent, you know. And then I go down that spiral of, well, it didn't happen, so it won't. or, I've done this how many times and so it can't. It becomes a personal thing. And again, that's not to be nitpicky around semantics, but I think that's the issue with that definition around how things should be. Mm-hmm. Who's to say they should be that way? Maybe we've never experienced it in the other way. That would get us an even better outcome or an experience,
Well, that's a great point. Looking back on this past year where we converted basically to virtual treatments, who would have thought that that was a good way of providing therapy services to people? I was
not about it for a very long time.
Now, I still have reservations about it in the sense that it's not quite the same.
No, definitely not.
As being in
not
person.
My element, that's for sure.
But it's still a viable option for people. And, beyond the whole virtual thing, we've learned that we can connect with people other than having lunch with them or going out and having coffee with them.
Right.
We've learned that there are different ways to do all the things that we've always wanted to do and have been doing for years. Mm-hmm. It's a matter of adjusting that path to getting where we want to go. Mm-hmm. Yeah. What about, a lot of what we've talked a little bit about today, anyway, has focused more on like clients. Mm-hmm. But it's important to recognize this is, worldwide. Mm-hmm. Like everybody has this processing of information, and it's the way we kind of manage life. People who are, not in treatment think this way, right? And so it's important that we recognize that the way we process information is pretty universal.
Human brain, how the human brain processes, yeah.
And so it's important that the strategies and the ideas that we're talking about is applicable for anybody.
Right. Mm-hmm.
And I would imagine that, people who are struggling at work that are not in treatment, but they really miss that social connection, right? So many people that I've talked to, neighbors, friends, who are working from home for this past year, have really missed getting together in the office and just like walking to the cubicle next to them, or walking down to the office next to down the hall and just having like small talk with somebody. It's definitely impacting us, but how can we get that accomplished some other way? I see so much more in the last year, neighbors sitting out in the driveway around the fire, all like 6 to 10 feet apart, but they're all getting together and we're doing it, right?
Yeah. But I think the reason, I guess, to clarify too, is that why some people end up coming to treatment is because we've gotten stuck in this pattern of doing it this one way for so long. I personally, I am very social and I hate being isolated, but over the time that I was isolated, it was almost hard for me then to come back to being in person, because I was like, I don't want to.
Well, that was the new norm now.
Yeah, like this was, you're invading my space now. I'm like, I can't talk to people. I don't have time to talk to people. Like it was.
To get dressed.
In actual pants, it was a very surreal shift. And I think that's one reason, a lot of times people end up coming to see a therapist is because you get so stuck in the routine, in the pattern of how things have been, that we don't really know or recall or remember how it could be any different. To your point, we don't ask the question. Right. How do I want it? We kind of sabotage that sometimes, and we're like, well, it's this way, so it has to be this way, without asking, like, do I want it to be that way still? Do I cut myself off from the possibility of change because I tell myself it's the only way, that it's not possible any other way?
Or is it just hard to think of another way?
Unless you're reaching out, asking supports like you alluded to
and
earlier.
Being open to actually thinking that there's another way. Even if I can't think of it right now, it's probably possible that it's another way to happen.
If you maintain that belief, yeah.
Yeah.
But what happens if you truly believe that you're stuck?
Then you stay stuck.
But I think that's something important to look at. I mean, a lot of times we hold on dearly to that belief system, not that we want it, but because it's easier and it's less scary to jump ship into something different when this is all you know.
Yeah.
Even if you remember a time when it was different, I mean, that transition's always the hardest,
I think it's important to point out, too, that these beliefs that we have are important to us. And they are what allows us to navigate our world. It allows us to recognize and have an understanding of what to expect. Like, I have certain beliefs about relationships, about jobs, about the world in general, society, family, parenting, and those beliefs have been developed over years. And I think they're very strong guides for all of us. And so when we challenge those beliefs, it's kind of challenging our core.
What does that mean about
It's
my
really
whole life?
hard. Yeah.
Yeah.
It makes you question, well, has my whole life been invalid or
Right.
like wrong if I change this belief? And I think that's one of the reasons people have a hard time changing their beliefs and being more flexible in how they approach life. And I think on the one hand, we have to maintain beliefs because, like I said, they're guiding principles.
Right.
Yet at the same time, if a belief isn't working, then it's time to question it, challenge it, and look at other options and other ways of, again, here's the goal, many ways to get there. Let's look at different ways to get there. You know, one of the things, too, that I wanted to bring up, because next week we have a guest who's going to be joining us, Dr. David Clements, who will be talking to us about medications and about psychiatry. And so if you have questions that you want us to be asking, feel free to let us know ahead of time. Again, it's going to be live, so call in that night. But, you know, one of the things I was thinking about is how our brain is kind of structured in a certain way, and those beliefs are kind of formed in our brain. And I'm wondering, you know, this will be a question for David, is how do medications shift that? And do they affect beliefs? Like, what's going to happen when I take that medication to, you know, oftentimes I think one of the questions that we'll ask next week is, I don't want to take a medication because it's going to change my personality. I don't want it to, you know, dampen me or like rev me up to a point where it's not me. So I don't want to take a medication that's going to change me. And so I think, you know, that'll be one of our questions next week. But I am curious, from a brain chemistry stance, how does that affect our actual beliefs? Do you think that impacts belief systems?
I mean, again, definitely a question to ask him next week, but I think, you know, the medication can't change the thought itself, right? Like, there's a lot of side effects that it'll be like, oh, you can have suicidal thoughts if you take this, or, you know, whatever that might be. But I think the purpose of medication, or the function behind it, is to help us achieve things that we want. So it helps with execution, right? Because there's certain parts of the brain that aren't firing the way that they need to. They're not talking the way to the other parts of the brain the way they need to. And so what I know about medication is that it's supposed to help kind of open up the pathways to communicate and to do those things. So, you know, belief systems might be more easily challenged when I'm taking certain medications, because I'm able to kind of think clearly and logically and execute things in the way that I intend. Whereas sometimes without medication, if I've been in this pattern for a long period of time, the brain is functioning in a very different way than I'm used to, or than is most helpful. So even though I understand thinking this way isn't helpful, it's the only way I know. Or like you said, it feels very unstable or unsafe to try to change it because, you know, maybe I have way too many automatic thoughts, or, you know, I have a lot of hopelessness, or, you know, physical sensation that's affecting the way that I can function and
then
think.
I'm responding to that physical sensation.
Right.
And then we're in a whole other realm of struggle.
And of course, that's in layman's terms. I'm sure he'll have a little bit more detail to kind of add to that, but that's definitely a good question. I don't think it changes the belief itself, but your ability to be able to think differently, I think, is extremely affected. But yeah, definitely a lot of fears for a lot of people around taking medication, just in general, and what it can do to you. And so I think there's a lot of validity in those questions and getting those answered. So,
and I think this might be another question next week, though, is we don't really know what medication does.
Technically,
or do
no.
I guess that'll be a question that I hope he can answer for us. But I'm really looking forward to having him on. He's a great guy.
Yeah.
We've known him for a few years now, and he's just so personable and so knowledgeable. It's really going to be fun.
I agree. Yeah, so definitely call in. The link is on our website, on the resource tab. It's also on our Facebook page. So if you guys have questions ahead of time, feel free to just send those in, whether it's through Facebook or email, or just log into the link, and then you can ask questions live next week.
And then also, as always, if you have other kinds of professionals or people that you would like us to to talk with and bring on the show, please let us know, because one of the goals is to helping people thrive, right? That's what this whole thing is about. And so there's lots of different ways. Remember, that's the goal.
Right.
Lots of ways to get there. So it's not just about having therapists or psychiatrists on, but anybody
Right.
that is thriving, for you to come on and let's talk about that together. So, all right,
Well, thanks
guys.
for joining us. We'll see you next week for a live at 7 p.m. on Wednesday.